Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Antonina Antosha with UATV. US President Donald Trump said he would support Russia rejoining the group of the world's major industrial nations, also known as the Group of Seven Nations. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson stated that Russia could not be readmitted into G7 because of the Kremlin's aggression in Ukraine and the use of chemical weapons in Britain. In 2014, the US and other nations kicked Russia out of then-known G8 after the Kremlin annexed Ukraine's Crimea and began its military intervention in Donbas. To talk more about the upcoming G7 summit, we're joined in the studio today by Julia Osmolovska. She's the international politics expert and executive director at the Institute of Negotiations. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So on August 20th, President Donald Trump expressed his support for reinstating Russia in the group of G7, making it back G8. What's the purpose? What's the aim of showing support to Russia, an open aggressor country?
Well, I wouldn't call it showing support to Russia in this case. I would call it Donald Trump's vision how to engage Russia in dialogue on the most acute international issues. And this was the core argument that he actually offered as supporting the very idea of getting Russia involved back into the meetings of G8. And he also claims that the main reason for Russia being excluded of the club was not, so he was not comparing, but actually he said that it was because of personal offense that his predecessor, Mr. Obama, felt against Russian president. And it was a sort of revenge or some compensation for these sore feelings that the former president of United States felt. However, official reason, and we can also reconfirm this from the statements of the other members of the club of G7, was that Russia brutally breached the international law and annexed Crimea illegally, and for all her efforts in supporting rebel groups in eastern Ukraine, Russia was actually excluded from the club. And the general assessment of those who are claimed to be the voters of international rule of law is quite justifiable, because the core reason hasn't been eliminated yet. So Russia hasn't given the Crimea back to Ukraine.
Well, that's exactly what President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said. His response was that Russia may return to the G7 only after the Crimea is back in Ukraine and the aggression in the east of Ukraine stops. And here I have a quote by him that he posted on his Facebook page. He said, "The return of occupied Crimea, the cessation of military operations in Donbas, and the release of more than 100 political prisoners and Ukrainian sailors held by the Kremlin will be a real serious signal to the world that Russia is ready to take its place on the agenda of high diplomacy again." So this is basically just a confirmation of what you just said earlier. However, President Zelensky is not the only one who has expressed this point of view. There's also Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So, well, here's what Macron had to say. He said that, I think to say that without any conditions Russia can return to the table would be signing off the weakness of the G7. Would you agree?
I would definitely, and especially taking into consideration the recent case of returning Russia to Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. It's actually Russia hasn't liquidated all the critics and the reasons for excluding of the Parliamentary Assembly before, and so it was returned back successfully. Therefore, there is high risk that the same move could be taken within the G7 club. However, we know already by the time that a number of countries who are the members of the club have expressed already explicitly their disagreement with unconditional return of Russia to G7. Therefore, I think that the prospects of actual rejoining Russia and enlarging the club into 8 members, I think they're quite vague for the time being.
Nevertheless, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is against Russia being reinstated in the G7 club. And then there's also Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And then there is Emmanuel Macron. But there is also President Trump. If it comes to the standoff, what could be the result of that?
I think that there could be one quite wise move to join two polarized views on Russia's presence at a G7 meeting. Because Trump wants to discuss the issue of major concern with Russia as well. And there is a principal disagreement of the absence of actually grounds for Russia to come back because the core reasons for her exclusion hasn't been eliminated. But nothing would prevent Mr. Trump, as a hosting country of G7 next year, to invite Russia for consultations, like this could be format 7+1. And this doesn't mean that Russia could be returned into the club with all the rights that she might have, but a sort of consultations on issues, and it could be a sort of like questioning what Russia has done so far with regard to Ukraine's conflict. So this could be very good platform to talk to Russia for all the leaders of major states in the world to question actually her on this issue. So it depends on how the parties would frame this very initiative.
Right.
So one side could be seen this as a sort of unconditional return of Russia to G7 club and make it G8 club, but the other would see as an opportunity for have this frank discussion and to question Russia on a lot of issues with regard to Ukraine destiny. So I think this could be like a double-sided process.
Was the possibility of Russia being reinstated in the G7 club, how should Ukraine behave? What should Ukraine do, and how should Ukrainian government react to these possibilities?
Well, Ukraine government has reacted quite reasonable so far. I mean, the open statement of our president and needs reference to all the issues that actually caused Russian exclusion. And the first moves that I've observed from our president is the talks with Boris Johnson, talks with President of European Union Tusk in the forthcoming days. Also possible telephone talks with Angela Merkel and the leader of Canada. So all these countries, we call it like channel diplomacy. So he could approach each of the members of G7 club bilaterally and talk about this issue. And moreover, we have, as I mentioned, quite strong arguments for our position, because Russia was excluded because of annexation of Crimea. So how you could get it back without
not the Crimea being brought back to Ukraine.
So just make the whole process obsolete. So you need to be consistent with your position, at least on this case. So I think there are grounds for our president to be very firm on his approach. On the other hand, we are not the members of G7, so this is the issue which should be decided within the G7 countries. And the position of Japan, for instance, which is leaning to consider the issue. So it's not something to say, let's get Russia back, but this is something that Japan is open for dialogue to consider this option. So a lot of will depend on how the general balance within the G7 countries will be found eventually. However, I'm pretty committed that for Germany, where the international rule of law order is one of the utmost priorities in in international affairs, so I think that they will be quite persistent with the position that there are no obvious reasons for Russia to come back. So it's quite early, because Russia hasn't reciprocated in different actions.
Right. Okay, well, my last question would be, what should we expect from the upcoming G7 summit?
interesting. I think that this issue would be discussed, but I don't think that, given the sensitivity of this issue, we won't be hearing a lot of like public discussions about the countries, among the countries about the issue. G7 always meet to discuss the most acute issues in international affairs, economic affairs, but bear in mind that they could come up with joint statement when there is a consensus on almost all issues they discussed, or they might just make some sort of statements on behalf of each country with regard to this meeting. So we do remember that one of the previous G7 meetings, Donald Trump hasn't signed the joint declaration. So I would hope that this time won't repeat the same story, and at least G7 would demonstrate some sort of coherency and a sort of understanding and consensus among the most burning issues of foreign affairs.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
That was Julia Osmolovska. She is the international politics expert and executive director at the Institute of Negotiations. Thank you so much for watching Head to Head. Stay tuned with UATV for the rest.